Are you ready for another day of jumping into Hebrews 11 and learning about the Hall of Faith? It's just such a powerful chapter, and why it's used a lot is because there's so much we can learn in our walk of faith. So we'll begin in verse 13 today. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. So they had a revelation, but they didn't see everything fulfilled. So Abraham began this walk in faith, received revelation, was persuaded to do God's will and to follow him. Yet he still didn't have he didn't receive all of that the promise was. So sometimes God gives us a promise that is meant for even our future generations, those that would come later, or for something as further out in the future. And that's where faith has to come into play. We very much follow the revelation and go about following God wholeheartedly and understanding that God gives continual revelation, not just a one-time thing, but he gives continual revelation. And that's what he did for Abraham. And he even did so again in stretching his faith in this next situation that we read about with him. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I love this passage because this passage was the one where the Puritans, the Pilgrims, which one was it? The Pilgrims or the Puritans? I think it was the Pilgrims. One of these groups of people, they were given this very word. Was it William Brewster? Anyway, they were given this word, this particular verse, and that's what got them to America. Is they were asking, Lord, what do we do? Do we stay? Do we try to change the culture where we are? What do we need to do? And this is the verse that was given to them. People who say such things, they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And that's why they went, and that's why they stayed. This was their verse that kept them where they were so they could begin this new city, this new home, this new country that would be set apart and become a heavenly country. Oh, every time I think of the story of how our country started and you truly understand it, it just brings tears to your eyes. Anyway, okay. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. This is the promise that God had given him. He has the promise in his hand, and yet God is saying, not only just to give him back to me, but to kill him. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, Abraham was willing to give up the very promise that God had given him, that he had received from God, because he trusted that God would raise him up from the dead. This is the way he was thinking, because he knew that God's word never fails. And he knew that God had said, through your offspring, Isaac, will all the rest of your descendants be multiplied. So at a time when Abraham must have been bewildered by God's command to kill his son. But yet he continues because he refused to act out of any other way other than the obedience of God and what God had told him. And because of that, God rewarded him. So Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So again, he is persuaded to follow through on this revelation. He knows that no matter what God tells him, that God is going to fulfill his word. If that means that Isaac dies, then God would raise him back up. This is how strongly he believed, and he had faith. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. So it wasn't Jacob's deceit. That's the thing, is because Jacob seemed to have deceived Isaac into blessing him instead of Esau. He's saying, no, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob, not the deceit. Because again, Isaac knew that whoever God needed the blessing to be passed to God would arrange things in the right way. And not only that, but again in verse 21, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons, and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Now, the very same thing happened here, because Joseph gets upset with Isaac blessing Jacob. Jacob was the younger, he shouldn't have been blessed. Well, then, and it should have been Esau. But now you have Joseph, who brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he places the oldest one on the right side in order to be blessed. However, Jacob crosses his hands, and he changes again the order. It was not the younger that, or it was not the older that received the blessing, but the younger. But it was by faith, because again, they trusted and they believed that God would direct the steps, and that through that the right ones would receive the blessings. And that's exactly what happened. So sometimes God allows the wrong things that we see in our natural mind to happen, so that way the blessing would go to the right one. And that's living in the supernatural and understanding that God directs our steps. And if we just follow and obey him, like whatever prompted that revelation for Jacob to cross his arms in that moment, God was leading him in that. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. So again, now he has a revelation that they are going to leave this place. They're going to leave Egypt. And here's the instructions for what I want you to do when you leave this place. And not just leave this place, but to return to the place from which you were supposed to have come, that your home is in Canaan. To the promised land that, again, your father Abraham had originally set up. In verse 23, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child. Again, they have a revelation. This is no ordinary child. In some translations, it says that he was beautiful. There's different ways. There's also, if you look at some of the older primary sources that confirm everything the Bible, that the Bible even says to go and read, it shares that Moses was radiant. There was a different, even a radiance when he was a child. So this is often what is being referenced here. He was beautiful. He was no ordinary child. He was radiant. There was a shining that came from him. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. They were so convinced of the revelation of God through this child that they were not afraid, and they were going to act upon it and save his life instead of allowing him to be killed. In verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. I love that this particular week, I didn't actually plan for this. I didn't even think about it. I didn't know where we were going to end up when I plan out my T's, just saying. But I love that we're actually studying this, and the T's this week is Bittia and Jochebed, both mothers of Moses. And the story of Bittia is a fascinating one. You'll have to, if you're part of the emails, you got some of that information, and it's just really, really fascinating. But Moses refused to be Pharaoh's daughter's son. He wanted to be known as a Hebrew, and he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time, because he had this revelation that the Hebrews were God's people, and he wanted to be a part of God's people, not on the opposing side. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward, that revelation, and he followed through on it. By faith, this is his action step. He left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He didn't. So I had always read about Moses leaving Egypt because of fear of what the Pharaoh would do, but it's saying here in Hebrews, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He had a revelation of God Almighty. And by faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So he follows through on Passover. He sprinkles the blood. He had that revelation of who God is. That's what led him out into the wilderness to go and seek the one that was calling to him, that would prepare him to be able to return and save his people, because in his present condition, he was not able to do so. But again, sometimes that goes to, we don't have the full understanding. Just as Isaac gave the blessing to Jacob, and then later on he felt like, oh no, I gave it to the wrong child. But God ordered his steps. Just like with Moses, he may have had some moments of, I've got to get away from here. They're going to kill me. Maybe not out of fear, but there was that pulling away. There was a drawing into the wilderness. Because again, God is ordering the steps. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. So the people, even though this ground and the fear of all of these walls of water and everything else that was surrounding them and the Egyptians behind them, they still followed in faith because they knew that God was taking them through. They had that understanding that God was going to lead them through. They trusted him and they obeyed and they walked through it. They didn't have to walk through it. They could have just believed, oh, God is great. Man, this is awesome. But then they would have never followed through, and then the Egyptians would have taken them right back into captivity. But they followed through. They obeyed, and they went through. Okay, we are going to stop, and I'll finish the rest of this tomorrow. It's a bigger portion, but we'll finish it up tomorrow.